I think that's the reason why so many bands get taken advantage of and lose all their monies, because they're not thinking about.
C.C. DeVille, the one they hated, kicked out, and forgot, only to celebrate later as a legend. No one ever jumped on stage like him. No one ever left the stage like him. And certainly, no one else got fired from the band right after a live MTV performance, only to be invited back years later with the words, "Without C.C., poison just isn't poison." C.C. DeVille, born Bruce Johannesson, lived out the wildest definition of rock and roll. He exploded onto the scene with blazing hair, a guitar that screamed every riff, and a grin balanced perfectly between madness and defiance. But behind that reckless charm were backstage brawls, drug-induced collapses, arrests, lawsuits, and the loneliness of someone who never truly fit in with the world he helped create. He was once called the clown who ruined the band, once passed out drunk while shooting his own music video, once phoned into a national radio show just to curse out the lead singer live on air. He refused to write new songs, insisting on playing only the ones he'd already written. And when faced with a choice between playing for 18,000 fans or staying loyal to 18 friends in his side project, he hesitated. So why was someone like that allowed to come back? Why did Poison, after all the chaos, still leave the door open for CC? Subscribe now so you don't miss a single chapter in the strange, chaotic life of CC DeVille. And join Rock Discovery as we retrace this wild journey from Brooklyn to the peak of MTV, from blackouts to breakdowns, from scandal to stardom, to understand why some people, no matter how many times they get kicked out, still get called back by the world of rock. Early life. C.C. DeVille, born Bruce Anthony Johannesson on May 14, 1962, in the Bay Ridge neighborhood of Brooklyn, New York, a place not built for loud dreams. Raised in a modest middle-class family, young Bruce grew up surrounded by honking cars, rigid traditions, and the constant feeling that he just didn't fit in. But even from an early age, he had something that made him different: an obsession with sound. At the age of 5, he was given a cheap electric guitar from Japan, costing only $27. To most, it was just a toy. But to Bruce, it was a doorway into a world no one else in Brooklyn could understand. While other kids were out riding bikes, he would sit for hours mimicking every guitar lick from records by Kiss, Led Zeppelin, Aerosmith, Van Halen, and especially the New York Dolls, the band that shaped both his fashion and stage attitude. Brooklyn wasn't kind to a kid who wanted to paint in color in a black and white world. Bruce always felt like an outsider, too loud to blend in, too eccentric to be accepted. Music wasn't just a hobby. It was an escape from the cramped streets and suffocating expectations that surrounded him. As a teenager, Bruce threw himself into guitar playing with manic intensity, experimenting with everything from glam to punk, and performing in local school bands. After high school, he enrolled in music theory classes at New York University, NYU, only to drop out shortly after, realizing the classroom could never teach him what his heart truly craved: the raw scream of the stage. At 18, Bruce packed up and headed west, carrying nothing but a guitar, a few pairs of ripped jeans, a new stage name, C.C. DeVille, and a dream of carving his place in rock history. He had no idea what he'd eat tomorrow or where he'd sleep that night. But one thing was clear: if he stayed in Brooklyn, the world would never remember his name. And then, in a dusty corner of Los Angeles, C.C. DeVille walked into a fateful audition, one that had just been left behind in disappointment by another guitarist named Slash, making room for the wild kid from Brooklyn. Hit subscribe to follow the next chapter, where the stage lights called his name for the first time, and rock and roll got a new misfit to worship. Early career. Los Angeles in the mid-'80s, a place where every rock fantasy burned under neon lights and layers of overlapping posters in the Sunset Strip nightclubs. Poison, a band that had just relocated from Pennsylvania to California, was in desperate need of a new lead guitarist. Their former member, Matt Smith, had returned home after learning his girlfriend was pregnant. Now, the band needed someone who could play hot, look like a star, and wear eyeliner without flinching. One name showed up for the audition: Slash, still an unknown, struggling musician who hadn't yet formed Guns N' Roses. He played well but didn't fit. He wasn't into the glam look and had zero interest in the flashy glam metal style Poison was chasing. A few days later, a wild-haired blonde from Brooklyn walked in, raspy-voiced, holding a guitar that looked like it might explode. DeVille. Within minutes, he left the room speechless. Not because of flawless technique, but because of his gunpowder-like energy, the way he broke the audition piece just to throw in his own riff, and somehow made it work. He wasn't like anyone else. And at that moment, Poison didn't want someone like everyone else, so CC officially became Poison's lead guitarist. But along with his talent and stage charisma came trouble. As drummer Ricky Rocket later admitted in the book Nothing But a Good Time, CC was a little bit of a bad influence. Honestly, he was doing crazy stuff even before we asked him to join the band. From the start, DeVille wasn't easy to manage. He showed up late, skipped rehearsals, and sometimes vanished for a whole day, only to return in a noticeably happier state. But in exchange, he delivered those signature riffs, that glittering chaos that made Poison stand out in a sea of big-haired California bands. Their debut album, Look What the Cat Dragged In, 1986, became a surprise explosion. The hit single, Talk Dirty to Me, built around a riff written by DeVille himself, shot up the charts and launched Poison from smoky clubs to MTV stardom. Ironically, that very riff would later be the center of a plagiarism lawsuit that dragged on for decades. Success came fast, and with it, both cheers and backlash. In the midst of flashing cameras, sold-out shows, and booze flowing like water, DeVille began slipping deeper into the very world he once dreamed of entering. When a band becomes famous too fast, the real price doesn't show up in the contract. It shows in what they start to lose with every show they play. Subscribe now to follow the next chapter, where the stage lights grew brighter, but DeVille began to spiral into the shadows. Breakthrough success. In less than 2 years after DeVille joined, Poison had risen from an unknown Sunset Strip Club band to a nationwide sensation. When they released their debut album, Look What the Cat Dragged In 1986, no one, not even the band themselves, thought a group with heavy makeup, flashy clothes, and sugary simple songs like Talk Dirty to Me could break through in an era ruled by guitar virtuosos. But the world wasn't just looking for technique. It was craving instinct, and DeVille, with a guitar that screeched like a steel saw on a dance floor, gave them exactly that. No one played like him. No one took the stage like him. And when that first riff of Talk Dirty to Me hit, people didn't just hear it. They felt something raw, reckless, almost ridiculous, but impossible to ignore. The album's success went far beyond expectations, but more importantly, Poison, through CC's guitar, redefined what glam metal could be. Not about complexity, but timing, volume, and the feeling of being utterly free. Fame came like an explosion, and like all explosions, it left shockwaves. Their second album, Open Up and Say, 1988, didn't just cement their place in rock, it proved that even party anthems could choke you up. Nothing But a Good Time hit like fireworks, but it was Every Rose Has Its Thorn that cut from behind. A heart-wrenching ballad where CC's guitar softened, slowed, and, for the first time, showed that even he had a heart that could break. That changed everything. Poison was no longer just a band of party-hungry pretty boys. They became an anthem for a generation lost in the chaos of Reaganomics and youthful confusion. And CC, despite the chaos in his personal life, remained the burning core of their music. The one man who captured the rhythm of a youth desperate to live fast, love recklessly, and cry for no reason at all. Success followed success. In 1990, they released Flesh and Blood, an album less glittery, more introspective. Songs like Something to Believe In echoed through funerals, weddings, goodbyes, and sometimes even during tour nights, CC couldn't remember playing, because by then, the cracks inside him were no longer easy to hide. He still played well, but not always on time. He was still creative, but erratic and out of control. In the studio, he missed sessions with no explanation. Recordings dragged on because CC kept disappearing into the bathroom. The producers knew what was going on. The band knew better. And amid sold-out tours and million-dollar contracts, Poison faced an unavoidable truth. They were standing on a stage soaked in gasoline, with a guitarist who always carried a lit match in his pocket. CC's ego was massive, but so was Bret Michaels. Each thought he was the center of Poison. And like all great bands, it was that very belief, I am everything, that made them lose everything. Arguments began over volume, set lists, stage positions, but that was just the surface. Beneath the makeup, they hated each other more than they dared to admit. CC once said, "I had everything I ever dreamed of, but if I still felt empty, what was I supposed to fill it with?" The answer was drugs, booze, impulse, destruction, louder, faster, more, as if turning the volume up could drown out the screaming inside. And so, from the guitarist who helped launch the band with multi-million-dollar hits, CC DeVille slowly became the ticking time bomb threatening to blow it all apart. Behind the guitar that once carried Poison to the top was a man spiraling within the very spotlight he created. In the next chapter, witness the sudden collapse. A night of live television where the guitar didn't make music anymore. It made tragedy. Collapse, conflict, firing. CC DeVille didn't fall because of one misstep. He fell gradually, bit by bit, all while still standing under the lights and the roar of the crowd. At a time when Poison was at its peak, 3 massively successful albums, millions of records sold out tours across the U.S. The very man who crafted their signature sound was slowly falling apart from within. In the studio, DeVille became increasingly unstable. He often showed up late or vanished mid-session without explanation, only to return in a state that everyone understood but no one dared to name. Producer Tom Werman once recalled that recording the solo for Nothing But a Good Time took 8 hours. Not because it was difficult, but because CC kept running to the bathroom. Tension in the studio thickened, not from music, but from everything left unsaid. On stage, he was still CC, wild, flamboyant, full of fire. But off stage, his relationship with Bret Michaels had gone from a crack to a deep fracture. Since the early Flesh and Blood tour, they no longer saw each other as bandmates, but as 2 egos that couldn't coexist. Arguments that once seemed harmless about guitar volume, set lists, turned into fuel for a deeper war. Who was really the soul of Poison? In September 1991, everything exploded on live television. During the MTV Video Music Awards, Poison was invited to perform their new hit, Unskinny Bop. But just a few notes in, CC played the wrong song, deliberately launching into Talk Dirty to Me, the classic hit that made them famous, as if to throw down a challenge. In that moment, every eye turned to him. But this time, there was no admiration, only confusion, anger, and disappointment. His guitar was unplugged mid-performance. Minutes later, backstage, he and Bret Michaels physically attacked each other. No more pretending, no more restraint. That night, DeVille was fired from Poison. No farewell, no negotiation. A year later, he called into a radio show where Bret was a guest. No apology, no explanation. Just a storm of harsh words broadcast nationwide. He accused Bret of betrayal. Bret fired back, saying CC wasn't mentally stable enough to work with. No one won the fight, but it was clear. Every bridge had been burned. But the chaos didn't stop there. In 2005, DeVille was arrested for domestic violence against his girlfriend. 3 days later, he was arrested again, this time for driving under the influence and causing an accident. He went to jail. The same images once used to promote tours now appeared in police files. There was no more doubt, no more excuses. C.C. DeVille had dragged himself to rock bottom, and this time, no one else was to blame. Around the same time, another lawsuit surfaced, this time from the band Kid Rocker, claiming that DeVille had stolen their demo from a 1984 audition and turned it into Talk Dirty to Me and other songs. The case was dismissed due to the statute of limitations, but it left behind a lingering question. Were the riffs that built the legend of C.C. even truly his? In just a few years, DeVille, once the guitarist who made tens of thousands scream, was now a tabloid regular. Poison guitarist arrested. Glam metal star spirals into violence. Former MTV icon behind bars. And yet, here's the irony. No one truly hated him, because C.C. never pretended. He was genuinely reckless, genuinely troubled, genuinely impulsive, and his mistakes, repeated, indefensible, were part of what made him an irreplaceable part of Poison. Others could play cleaner, but no one could make audiences remember like C.C., even with just one stupidly perfect riff. And just when it seemed his story had ended, when the stage lights dimmed, when every door seemed shut, somewhere in a dusty corner, someone unexpectedly opened one last door. Subscribe and keep following the journey of DeVille, because the story wasn't over yet. Rebirth and reunion. No one thought C.C. DeVille would come back. Not the fans, not the media, and certainly not anyone in Poison. After the fights, the addiction, the collapse of his reputation, his name had become a symbol of instability, the price rock and roll paid when it pushed too far beyond control. But just when it seemed like his story had ended, he reappeared, quietly, sober, and calmer than ever. In 1995, during a rare lull between the rise of grunge and the fading of glam metal, DeVille began saving himself. He checked into rehab. No press releases, no headlines. This wasn't a comeback for fame. It was a fight to survive. In a later interview, he admitted, "I was addicted to the feeling of being drunk more than the alcohol itself. I loved how things got blurry, like I could disappear and no one would notice." But eventually, that very sense of disappearing became what made him feel like he was nothing. When Poison decided to reunite in 1996 for a nostalgia tour, no one initially considered calling C.C. back. But after tense negotiations with replacement guitarists, none of whom ever felt right, the band realized that love him or hate him, C.C. was still the only one who made Poison sound like Poison. Then, during an unannounced rehearsal, C.C. walked into the studio, no apologies, no explanations, picked up his guitar, and played the intro to Look What the Cat Dragged In. The room went silent. No one said a word, but everyone knew he was back. The reunion tour exceeded expectations. Thousands of fans returned, not just for nostalgia, but for the irreplaceable presence of the man they once watched fall. There was something strange about the way the crowd responded to C.C. They didn't see him as a rock star anymore. They saw him as a survivor, a witness to a bygone era, scars and madness included, and that made him more real than anyone else. But the reunion wasn't without its cracks. In 2000, tensions resurfaced when DeVille wanted his side band, Samantha 7, to open for Poison on tour. Bret Michaels refused. Old resentments came roaring back. C.C. disappeared again, stopped answering calls, missed rehearsals. Everyone assumed he was gone for good. Then, 2 weeks later, at an annual music event in Los Angeles, C.C. showed up, casually standing in line at a booth where Ricky Rocket was signing autographs. No drama, no explanation. They looked at each other, smiled, and started talking like no punches had ever been thrown. It wasn't reconciliation. It was acceptance. They had come too far to hold on to childish anger. CC later admitted he returned for one reason only. I could play in front of 18,000 people with Poison, or 18 people with my own band. I chose the audience. At first glance, the line sounded blunt, maybe even selfish. But for someone who had lost everything to ego, realizing who you need and who needs you is already a major step forward. Since then, DeVille has stayed with Poison. No more chaos, no more headlines. He doesn't try to prove he's changed. He doesn't beg to be loved again. He just plays, with the same guitar tone that once lifted him up and nearly destroyed him. And somehow, the audience never asked for anything more. He was never stable. But after everything, CC is still here, quiet, steady. And maybe in rock and roll, that's enough. Personal life. CC DeVille was known for being loud, but his personal life was a different world, one without stage lights, screaming guitars, sold-out shows, or backstage brawls. In that space, there was no rock star with a rap sheet, no fired bandmate, no walking crisis. There was only a quiet, slightly odd man, someone completely unrecognizable from the image he once crafted for himself. Throughout his career, DeVille rarely spoke publicly about his romantic relationships, not because he had nothing to say, but because he no longer wanted to say anything. After years of scandals, domestic abuse, drunken episodes, self-sabotage, he seemed to understand that some parts of life were better kept behind closed doors. The one thing he never hid was his son. In 2007, at the age of 45, CC DeVille became a father for the first time. The boy was named Vallon, an unusual name, like no other, and yet fitting for the way CC saw the world. He once said that the moment he saw his son born was the first time he felt the need to stay sober longer than a tour. Not because of reputation, not for redemption, but because for the first time, an innocent life was looking at him like he was the whole world. That boy grew up in a home far from glamorous. No paparazzi, no rebellious parents on Instagram. DeVille, once the guitarist who made audiences across America scream, spent most of his free time building Lego with his son, driving him to school, or sitting for hours watching cartoons together. When asked once about the craziest thing he'd done in his personal life, he simply smiled and said, "I once turned down a big gig because the kid had a fever. That was the first time I put someone above rock and roll." And like many who've been through hell and back, he began gravitating toward gentler things. The music was still there, but he no longer played to prove anything. He played to stay connected. He wrote a few songs of his own, some of which were never even released. He appeared on reality shows like The Surreal Life, not to shock or grab attention, but maybe just to try living in the real world for a few days. Close friends described DeVille as a wonderfully strange man, often misunderstood. He might curse, act weird, or disappear mid-conversation, but he could also sit in silence for hours just to listen to someone else. He didn't fit any mold, not the ideal father, not the model musician, and certainly not your typical celebrity. But maybe that's exactly why people still remember him. And there's irony in this. His career once shattered under the weight of his ego, but in the end, the thing that tethered him to this world wasn't fame or legacy. It was a little boy who shared his last name, who didn't see him as a legend, just as a dad who always came home after every show. Legacy and influence. CC DeVille was never the most technically gifted guitarist of his generation. He didn't play with the virtuosity of Steve Vai, the abstraction of The Edge, or the emotional depth of David Gilmour. In fact, to many guitar purists, he was little more than a lucky guy, someone who rose to the top more by attitude than ability. But nearly 4 decades later, while many once revered names have faded, DeVille still stands. Not because he was perfect, but because his imperfections made him irreplaceable. His guitar style was intentional chaos, impulsive, high energy, a little messy, but always effective. He didn't play to impress fellow musicians. He played for regular people, those living ordinary lives. craving something explosive for a few minutes just to feel young, wild, and free again. And in an era where rock was becoming coldly complex, it was this rawness, this instinctive simplicity, that made Poison and DeVille stand apart. Without Talk Dirty to Me, there would be no Look What the Cat Dragged In. Without the reckless solo on Nothing But a Good Time, Poison would never have become MTV's ultimate party band. And without the slow, aching licks of Every Rose Has Its Thorn, they would never have touched the emotional depth that glam metal rarely dared to reach. In every signature Poison song, DeVille's fingerprints are unmistakable. No studio tricks, no grandstanding. Just one riff, and fans knew it was him. Many artists later cited CC as an inspiration. Not because he was the best, but because he made them believe they could. In a world where talent was often boxed into formal training and rigid standards, DeVille was living proof that emotion and personality could open doors technique alone never could. His legacy isn't measured in awards or chart positions. It lives in smaller, more persistent places, like how Talk Dirty to Me remains one of the most played riffs in guitar shops across the country, or how Poison t-shirts still show up on the backs of 50-year-old men at reunion concerts, not because they idolized the whole band, but because they once dreamed of being CC, even just for a night. More importantly, DeVille, despite being fired, ridiculed, and dismissed as the rotten apple of glam metal, was never someone the band could truly leave behind. Others tried to replace him. All of them stepped aside, because no one else could make Poison sound like Poison, except the very man who once blew it all up and then stitched it back together with his guitar. CC was never a symbol of perfection, but he remains a living embodiment of unapologetic rebellion, the kind of spirit rock and roll is quietly losing. And maybe in a world increasingly obsessed with being polished, clean, and in control, the rough-edged shadow of CC DeVille still matters. A scar that reminds us rock and roll in its purest form was never meant to be flawless. It only needed to live and scream in ways others were too afraid to try. Current life. Now in his 60s, CC DeVille is no longer the wild soul of the 1980s, but he's never been the kind of artist to quietly fade away. While many of his peers have stepped off the stage or slipped into seclusion, CC continues to show up, not to cling to the past, but as a living testament to the final flames of glam metal when everything was still loud, wild, and unapologetically fun. In 2024, Poison joined the Stadium Tour alongside Mötley Crüe, Def Leppard, and Joan Jett, performing in massive arenas across the U.S. on stage. CC didn't just bring back hits like Talk Dirty to Me and Nothing But a Good Time. He stunned audiences by soloing Van Halen's Eruption, a bold and heartfelt tribute. Viral videos across social media showed that he still had it. Nimble fingers, instinctive showmanship, and an energy that defied his age. However, by year's end, as fans anticipated a 2025 extension of the tour, drummer Ricky Rocket confirmed Poison's return, only for plans to stall when Bret Michaels reportedly decided not to continue. CC made no public statement, but he remained present, appearing at events, on talk shows, and especially in in-depth interview series with Living Legends Music, where he openly discussed his musical journey, past wounds, and his uniquely offbeat philosophy of life. Outside of music, CC now spends most of his time with family. He lives in California with his wife Shannon Malone and their son Valen, a surprisingly peaceful life for someone once seen as a symbol of chaos. On Instagram, fans occasionally glimpse quiet moments with his son or home-shot videos of him practicing guitar, simple but sincere windows into a man who's found grounding. He's said that staying sober enough to be a father is the most important thing he's gained, after everything he's lost. CC is no longer a fixture on MTV, no longer shredding solos under fireworks in Las Vegas. But he never disappeared. He's still here, quietly, steadfastly, living by the one thing that once saved him: playing music not to prove anything, but simply to exist. And in a world where rock has, in many ways, lost its untamed edge, CC DeVille, somehow, still holds on to it in every note he plays. Not perfect, but profoundly real. CC DeVille was never the most technically skilled guitarist, nor was he the greatest riff writer of the 80s. He was often called messy, amateurish, even the troublemaker within his own band. But if you look back at the fiery era of glam metal, a strange truth emerges. Without CC, there would be no "look what the cat dragged in," no nothing but a good time, and certainly no Poison as we knew them, chaotic, flashy, glittering, but unforgettable. He was the embodiment of a raw kind of rock and roll, impulsive, instinctive, unpolished, and always willing to gamble with his own life. He failed in public, collapsed under the spotlight, clashed with his bandmates, and came back as if he'd never left. Not because he was right, but because only he could make that sound. If you've ever sung along to "Every Rose Has Its Thorn" or shrugged your shoulders to "Talk Dirty to Me," then a part of you, whether you admit it or not, still belongs to the world of CC DeVille. And if you believe his story is worth telling, leave a comment below. Share your thoughts about this wild and flawed artist, and don't forget to subscribe to Rock Discovery, where we celebrate the legends who weren't perfect but were never replaceable. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.